There are roughly 510 million square miles of land surface on Earth. And thanks to modern aerial mapping tools like Google Earth, we've been able to look at almost every square inch of it. What researchers, hobbyists, and curious minds have found, hiding in plain sight, is something that doesn't have a clean explanation. Massive networks of channels, cut into the Earth with striking precision, running in perfectly straight lines, forming right angles, stretching for hundreds of miles across multiple continents, and yet almost nobody is talking about them. Today we're going to look at what these structures are, where they've been found, and ask the questions that mainstream sources haven't quite gotten around to answering yet. Let's start with the basics. When you pull up certain regions on Google Earth and zoom in, particularly in northern Russia, Germany, Finland, Belarus, and Ukraine, you start to notice something unusual. The land is carved up into elaborate grid systems, channels, ditches, raised earthen banks, all arranged in patterns that look almost mechanical. The mainstream explanation is irrigation. And honestly, that's a reasonable starting point. Historians and archaeologists have documented irrigation systems going back thousands of years, from ancient Mesopotamia to the Roman Empire. The idea that farmers dug channels to direct water toward their crops is well established and makes practical sense. In fact, some researchers with first-hand experience in rural farming confirm that small-scale channel irrigation is still used today in certain parts of the world. A farmer opens a gate, water flows through a channel, feeds one row of crops, then you redirect it to the next. Simple, low-tech, effective. So the basic concept isn't controversial. What raises questions is the scale. Some of these systems don't cover one field. They don't cover one farm. They appear to stretch across hundreds of square miles of terrain in regions that today are largely uninhabited, covered by dense forest or located far from any known major historical settlement. That's where it gets interesting. Here's the part that researchers keep coming back to, and it's a fair point to raise. When you zoom in on these channel systems, they aren't rough or irregular. They run in near perfect straight lines. They meet at what appear to be precise right angles. The spacing between channels is often remarkably consistent, almost as if someone was working from a plan. Now, that alone doesn't rule out ancient construction. Skilled builders throughout history achieved impressive geometric precision without modern surveying equipment. The Romans engineered aqueducts and roads with extraordinary accuracy. Indigenous cultures across the Americas built earthworks that still impress engineers today. But here's the honest question worth asking. Who, specifically, built these? When? And what was the purpose of systems on this particular scale? Because some of these grids extend far beyond what any single farming community would need. We're looking at infrastructure that, if it was agricultural, would have required coordinated labor across enormous areas, more comparable to modern industrial farming than anything we typically associate with the ancient world. One researcher put it plainly, any old trench near a river would do the job if all you needed was to water a field. Why build something this precise? Why extend it this far? Those are reasonable questions, and so far, no single well-documented answer has been offered for the full scope of what we're seeing. What makes this harder to dismiss is that these channel systems aren't isolated to one region. They've been identified in Greenland, where some are described in historical records as medieval in origin, cut through notoriously rocky terrain. In Iceland, in Scotland's Isle of Skye, along the coastlines of Long Island and New Jersey in the United States, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, in Bolivia and Peru near Lake Titicaca. And here's something worth noting about the Scotland and South America comparison specifically. Aerial imagery of the raised field systems on the Isle of Skye shows a striking visual similarity to the Wadu Wadu earthworks found near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia and Peru. Both involve raised platforms separated by channels, constructed in regions with very different climates, cultures, and histories. The conventional interpretation is that similar agricultural challenges produce similar solutions. That may well be the full answer. But it's also a question that researchers haven't fully closed the book on, and it seems worth acknowledging. Along the east coast of the United States, Particularly in marsh and coastal areas, intricate channel patterns are visible from aerial views that look almost engineered. Some researchers have suggested these could be remnants of an earlier landscape, one that interacted with the coastline differently than it does today. Whether that's connected to natural land change, deliberate construction, or both, that's still an open question. There's another layer to this that complicates the timeline. In many of the locations where these channels appear, mature forest has grown up around them, and in some cases, directly inside the channels themselves. Trees that, based on their size and density, appear to be decades or even centuries old. If forest is growing inside these channels, that tells us something. The channels predate that forest growth, which pushes the construction date back, potentially much further back than casual observation might suggest. Dendrochronology, the science of dating trees by their rings, could in theory help establish when these channels stopped being actively maintained. But detailed studies of that kind haven't been widely published for most of these sites, at least not in sources readily available to the public. So we're left estimating. Some researchers speculate these systems are 200 to 500 years old. Others think certain examples could be older. Without proper on-the-ground archaeological dating, it's genuinely difficult to say with confidence. Here's what strikes me as the most honest framing of this topic. The agricultural irrigation explanation is credible. It's supported by known historical practices, and there's no strong reason to reject it outright. For many of these sites, it's probably the correct explanation, or at least part of it. But a credible explanation isn't the same as a documented one, and for the vast majority of these channel systems, we don't have documented studies identifying who built them, when they were constructed, or what specific purpose they served at that particular location. Historians and archaeologists have focused substantial attention on more visible ancient structures, monuments, temples, burial sites. Channel systems embedded in remote landscapes haven't attracted the same level of systematic study, at least not publicly. One question that comes up among researchers is whether sea level data over the past 2,000 years is fully understood or accessible. Some channels appear in coastal and low-lying areas that today seem marginal for agriculture, which raises the possibility that the terrain looked different when they were built. That's a hypothesis, not a conclusion, but it's the kind of question that deserves a proper answer. There's also the matter of a reportedly blurred area visible near some of the finished channel sites on certain mapping platforms. Whether that's a technical artifact, a coincidence, or something else, it's the sort of detail that makes you want to look harder. I want to be clear about what I'm not saying here. I'm not saying these channels are the product of a lost civilization or that history has been deliberately hidden from us. I don't think we need extraordinary explanations when ordinary ones are available. What I am saying is that there's a gap, a real one, between what we can see in aerial imagery and what has been formally documented and explained about these structures. That gap deserves attention. These channel systems span multiple continents. They display consistent geometric precision. They appear in locations that don't always align neatly with what we know about historical population centers. And in many cases, they've been sitting there, largely unexamined, while the forest grows up around them. The most intellectually honest position is simply this: we don't know enough yet, and that's reason enough to keep looking. If you live near any of the regions mentioned in this video, Russia, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Scotland, Bolivia, the East Coast US, and you've seen these structures in person, I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Ground level observation matters. If this kind of deep look, slow burn investigation is something you want to see more of, subscribe and hit the bell. It helps more than you might think.